Anaxagorou is a British-born Cypriot poet, fiction writer, essayist, publisher, and poetry educator. In 2015, he won Groucho Maverick Award. His new collection of works is called After The Formalities, and his poetry is of a very strong kind. It received quite some positive reviews, and there were remarks like, "It's a burning rage with a delicate taste," or "This poetry is formal and experimental and dexterous and oral and democratic and radical. These poems work as poems should, enacting deep thought towards philosophies, and they make hopeful." Hi, Anthony.
Hey, how you going? You all right?
Hey. So, what do you think of these reviews? Do you think poetry should be enacting deep thought, like this review was saying, actually?
I don't know. I don't think poetry should be any one thing. It will become quite boring if we try to dictate and govern what poetry should and shouldn't be.
Right.
I like to write in the way that I kind of think about the world and the way that I navigate the world, and I try and stay true to that, whether it be, statesman-like, dogmatic, as some people have said before. I just speak on behalf of myself and the people that I live among and around. But I don't think poetry should ever be one singular thing.
By the way, I completely forgot, of course, I have to show, what you've just made recently. There's one poem in here, right in the beginning, which is called Cause. And you write there, "To be British is to be everywhere." What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean just that. To be British is to be everywhere. The history of the British Empire, at one point, 23% of the globe was under British occupation of some kind. And the legacies of colonialism and imperialism are still being seen and felt by many different groups of people around the world today. So for me, it's a comment, it's a gesture, it's a suggestion towards the British imperialist project and the way in which they saw themselves and how they've managed to infiltrate many different aspects of global life and human history.
But you could say, the British Empire first, the British were everywhere. Now, all these countries, all these places where they were, they're actually coming back to Great Britain. And it became this mixed society. What does that do to the society? What does it do to people?
There's the famous quote, "I'm here because you were there." And I kind of feel that with migration, with, like I say, the legacies of colonialism and the way that global politics have been shaped by America, by Britain, by France, by all these kind of colonial powers throughout the 20th century and the 19th century, we're seeing an amalgamation of different groups of people trying to get to places where they can sustain themselves and have a certain quality of life. And I think, I'm born and raised in London. My parents came here. My grandparents came here from Cyprus. Cyprus was still a British colony at the time, up until 1960 was when it got independence. And so I kind of feel the reasons why my parents or my grandparents came here was to seek a better life, because what the British had done in that country had caused such poverty and destitution that life was no longer a kind of sustainable way of being. So they sought better options. And obviously, if this country has all the privileges and the good fortune, then the idea was to come here. And it was the same throughout Africa, throughout the Caribbean, throughout Asia, in the Americas. It was, the streets were paved with gold, is what my grandmother thought. That was how Britain marketed themselves,
Actually, your grandmother has quite an important role in your work, I think. I mean, it's dedicated to Stella. Stella is your grandmother?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Yeah, you describe also, that she died, her funeral. I was wondering, because you also have a son yourself.
Yeah.
What do you think that you got from your grandmother that you're now giving to your son? Is there some heritage line here? Heretical line?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different with each generation. You know, like my grandma died at 96 and my son was 3. So there was a huge generational gap between, and also my grandma couldn't talk English. She spoke Cypriot Greek. And so, they couldn't really communicate. And my son wasn't really talking at 3 properly anyway. So, I don't know. I think I've learned a lot. My experiences, I spent the first 5 years of my life in her care. She was like my carer because my parents worked more or less full time until the age of 4 or 5 years old. And so I think I had an affinity towards my grandmother that kind of was more akin to like a second mum, as opposed to just like a grandmother. She was a socialist, although she didn't know what socialism meant because she was practically illiterate. But she had values that we would probably identify with socialism.
What kind of values?
That poor people shouldn't be poor, that the government needs to do more to ensure that people have access to education, have access to equality, to healthcare. Again, coming from Cyprus, it was different because she lived during both colonial period and the 1974 conflict as well. So she'd seen 2 very big things. She served in World War II for the British in Egypt. Yeah, she was conscripted.
That's pretty cool. So, yeah,
it was cool. But I think that kind of, she wasn't the most cerebral of people, but again, she was from a village. But, the way that just that natural philosophy, not the philosophy you get from reading, high-minded books, just a perception that I think she had a way of distilling the world in this very natural logic that I really I like. That humanism, I guess, is probably the closest we can get to thinking about it.
Do you think that her humanism sort of, influenced you, and that it's also something you want to share with your son again?
Yeah, for sure. Like my goal, I think, as a father is to try and contextualize the world as much as I can, which is what I think was missing from my upbringing, was nobody ever put the world into context for me. I had to kind of do the heavy lifting on my own. And my parents had their views and their opinions, but it wasn't one of these families where you sit down and you talk to your kids about it. It was your kids should just be quiet, get out of the way, go and do your own thing. Okay. So it was it was a bit different. And I feel that I had to go the long way round to get a real kind of understanding of how the world worked and how history worked,
How do you put it into context for your son then? What do you do as a parent?
I respond to his curiosities. So as curiosities emerge, you respond to them in the best way that you can. Like he's asked about skin color, he's asked about hair type, he's asked about gender. Gender is very prevalent with him. And I kind of feel that, talking about these things, to not create hierarchies, to not create distinctions, to try and be as objective about the reasoning as possible at this kind of very, I guess, superficial level where you're just responding to the world in a very immediate sense without going into too much nuance or detail. Right. He's only 5, so I'm not going to start, bringing out Hegel's dialectics on him. But then at the same time, I think it's important to have, a framework that that you organize the world around.
Does he know who Trump and Biden are?
He knows who Boris Johnson is because he listens to Storm, he listens to Stormzy quite a lot.
How would you describe Boris Johnson to him?
We just have to say, these people are not very nice people, and they have a very
there
particular...
goes your raven.
he did that raven for me. Okay. So yeah, I have to try and keep it simple, but at the same time he has questions, like who's Boris Johnson and who's this and...
In your poem In Things Already Lost, you describe actually the world the way your son sees things. I'm just going to quote 3 sentences. In the bath, he needs to know where water ends when it disappears along with dirt. I was wondering that wonderment that a child has. It sort of made me think, that's maybe being part of a poet is to keep a certain wonderment about how you receive and view the world. Is that what you think as well?
100%. You know, like Mary Ruefle has a beautiful line where she says, or she asks her students, would you prefer knowledge or wonder? Would you prefer to know or would you prefer to wonder?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it kind of, you know, poets work around wonder, artists work around wonder. It's the idea of imagining an alternative. And I kind of feel keeping that reception open, keeping that frequency in the place where anything can happen is what allows you to keep making interesting images and interesting art and interesting metaphors and pieces of work. Right. And so I think with children, like you say, because they have a natural capacity to think about the world in this very lateral kind of almost surreal upside down kind of way, which is exactly how artists kind of, you know, when they're working around ideas, that's kind of how they start to, I guess, amalgamate different thoughts.
Right.
It makes really good poetry, I think. And
so it can be really a source of inspiration for you, actually, the way you view things.
Yeah, and also, like, you know, death anxiety. When a child becomes aware of mortality, what happens? How do you then explain that one day your dad and your mom are going to die? And our job, in a way, is to help you live in the world once we're not here.
Yeah.
How do you start to kind of reckon with that? Mm-hmm. So, you know.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you something completely different, because you founded Outspoken, which is grown into one of the leading poetry nights in London. But of course, you know, we're struck with COVID-19. I'm just wondering, you know, how's the situation? How's the situation for poets in England?
Everyone's struggling in the performance side of things. I mean, you know, we're doing the online stuff and we're making do with what we can, but it's not the same. And I think for a lot of poets who spoken word artists, performance poets who weren't necessarily working in education. I'm quite fortunate because most of my work is in teaching anyway, so I've transferred all that online. But yeah, I mean, Outspoken, I don't think it's going to come back until next year. Right. We have to obviously follow what the South Bank are doing. And so when they open, we open. So yeah, I mean, it's not great. It's sad, actually. Like, I just miss being in an audience and reading poems and feeling the energy from a room full of people and feeling that intensity and that concentration fed back.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna cite some poetry for us in a few minutes, but I just wanted to already discuss one of the poems that you're probably going to read, Uber. It's about, you know, I presume it's you sitting in the cab with a driver who comes from Mauritius. And, well, it really is, it actually sort of captures the whole situation that is going on in London with different people from different backgrounds that come together, and it's quite obvious in a way this cab driver is kind of lost in between different worlds. I'd just like you to elaborate a little bit on it.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, that's it. I you know, the poem was inspired, well, not inspired, but I had the idea on the day of the referendum. I was in a cab, and it was actually...
You mean Brexit, right?
Yeah, on the Brexit in 2016, me and my friend were in an Uber, and we were going to the shopping centre to pick up... he was making a music studio, and we had to go and pick up some bits for the studio. And, you know, these guys at the traffic lights, they pulled the window down, and they just hurled abuse at us in the car. But there was such a kind of buoyancy, like a fervency to the way in which they now felt emboldened to just put a window down and just hurl, go home. And then they swore and they said something stupid, they laughed and they drove off. And like all three of us kind of sat in, and my friend was Jamaican, I'm Cypriot, that guy's from Mauritius. Yeah. And so they probably just saw three guys in there who didn't look English. And so it, you know, it stayed with me for a very long time. And I thought, you know, for about a year, I was mulling it over and trying to work out what does that tell me? What does that tell us? And what does that tell about the state of the nation?
What does it tell about the state of the nation, you think? I mean, does this happen often to you?
And not so much. I mean, I live in London. I live in I live in central London. It is hugely kind of metropolitan. It's massively multi-ethnic, multiracial. Hackney, you know, like everyone's here. So no, you don't get that. If you go, I've been to other parts of England where things have happened to me. People have said stuff, not knowing where I'm from. Just I look different to how they expect or how they think people should look in those areas. So yeah, there has been. What's that? Sorry.
What kind of things would they tell you? Say to you?
Oh, I mean, you know, example. I went to a place called Stone. And I walked into a pub because it was raining outside and I was doing a gig and my train was an hour and a half early. So I went into this pub, I walked in and the guy behind the bar, like there was about 6 blokes, you know, white guys with skinheads, that shave heads, whatever, beer drinkers. And you walk in and the whole place just literally just the voice, all you could hear was just the radio playing. And I said to the guy, can I get half a Guinness? And he just went, no.
Wow.
And I didn't know what to do. You know, at that point, I literally did not. And I looked around and everyone was just looking at me. So I just went, excellent. I think I just went, excellent. And
that's what you said. And then you walked out?
I walked out, yeah. I just went, that was it. And I was just like, wow, that would not, just no. Like who, you know, no.
Right.
And I don't know why. I don't know if because of how I was dressed. I don't know if because how I looked. Maybe I spoke. They just did not like me. And, you know, you start getting paranoid and you start to think, what did I do? Was it the way I was dressed? Was it the fact that I just looked different? You know, like, so who knows?
So, but I'm just going to be quick because I think we should really take time for your poetry. But how do you change this into poetry? I mean, is poetry there also as an expression of rage or criticism or political criticism? What do you think?
I think poetry for me is a reckoning a lot of the time. It's a way of fusing emotion, sentiment, intellect, philosophy, and, you know, throwing it all into one big pot. I think that's kind of how I see it. And that's how it, for me, that's how it works. That's how I like to use it. It's how I enjoy writing. I don't ever set out to kind of try and change the reader's opinion.
Right.
I don't. That's not what it's about for me. It's about allowing them to think about the world in maybe in an alternative way, maybe in a way that they think, I don't understand this, I don't agree with this, this makes no sense. The fact that there's some kind of engagement or participation is kind of what I'm interested in. But like I say, it's more just me writing for myself as a way of trying to make sense of the things that I see and think and hear.
Does it come out in a wave, or is it carefully composed, or does it change?
It's very arduous. It's difficult. It goes through many iterations. Okay. I usually write in one burst to begin with, and then I could spend weeks, days, months sometimes going back and fine-tuning. I mean, that book took 3 years to write, and there's 36 poems in there. So, you know, it's a lot of combing and combing and combing.
Okay. Well, you know, since it has been so much work, we definitely should give you some time to read a few now. So I'm going to give you the stage, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll start off with the poem Uber, seeing as we were just talking about it. Door shuts, winds slap a magic tree around. A radio hums songs into us both. One of 2 phones rings. From an edge, he tells her he'll call back in a language half packed back when I assume things took a turn for the worse. A flag hanging from the rear view. I ask where. He says Mauritius. Returning my question, I say Cyprus, asking if he prefers it here. He says sleep is easier, the roads at night less congested. At the lights I ask about children. From his pocket he pulls a photo of a girl. I note the way her smile matches her mother's. In the picture everyone's together, smiling. She turned 9 last week, he said. It's been over 5 years. Now, rain. Wipers wave like a tired pair of arms. A car makes an emergency stop. A homeless man moves like a saw into traffic. When will you see her again, I ask? Soon, soon. Now, traffic builds. The other way would have been quicker, he says. To our right, a van pulls up. 2 men motion to lower windows. In rain, he does, we do. Go home, home, go home, home. Laughing up a storm front, then speeding off. He tucks his daughter back in, her mother, himself, gripping the wheel like a gun. How much can a pair of hands keep? One of 2 phones rings, declining the call. The song on the radio ends. An ad suggests a weekend break to Europe, turning it off, bringing us right into where we were, asking, what about you? Do you have children? Do you prefer it here?
Nice, very nice, thank you. Well, please, another one.
Okay, let's do cause as well, seeing as you mentioned that one. And to the burning I say, my worry is a whole country. I've been myself longer than my undoing. Heavy trunk of silverware, museum glass polish, portraiture of bent flags. I'm here as my grandparents were, only with a moving mouth. During empire, my people were subjects first, citizens later, once the vigilantes managed to zip up their coats. Flames lambent. My grandmother died with umbrellas outstretched in her gut. My grandmother died. To be British is to be everywhere. Some roots have been in the earth for so long they know only to call themselves earth. A worm's pink nipple bleeds into snow. My birth, my mother's brown skin. I'd already filled half myself with Britannia's air. It took them a month to find my name.
Beautiful, thanks. Could you maybe also do After the Formalities?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So this is the title poem from the book. Just to kind of give you a bit of context, because you can't see the poem, it looks at the kind of chronology of race as a construct that emerged in the 15th century, and every 100 years it took on a different variant, and different groups of people were racialized in different ways. And so I kind of traced that and used those periods as a springboard to explore my own family's experience with migration, race, taxonomies, and living outside of their country of origin. And this is called After the Formalities. In 1481, the word race first appears in Jacques Debrez's poem, The Hunt. Debrez uses the word to distinguish between different groups of dogs. In that hard year, grandparents arrived on a boat with a war behind them and a set of dog leads. Bullet holes in the sofa, burst pillows, split rabbits, passports bound in fresh newspapers, bomber planes, a dissenting priest, a money bag sucking worry. On the boat, grandmother anticipated England's winters with the others, slick snow on gold streets. Grandfather grieved 2 dogs he'd left. Pedigrees, blue bottles decaying at the base of their bowls. The dogs of England were different. The water, though, fine to drink. In 1606, French diplomat Jean Nicot added the word race to the dictionary to denote distinctions between different groups of people. Nicotine is named after him. In London, grandparents lived with only a radio. A lamp favouring the wall's best side, curtains drawn, Byzantine icons placed on paraffin heaters, arguing through whispers, not wanting to expose tongues, stories circulating, what neighbours do if they catch you saying, I'm afraid, in a language that sounds like charred furniture being dragged across a copper floor. Grandfather always blew smoke out the lip of his window, so too did his neighbour, colourless plumes merging, how it's impossible to discern the brand of cigarette a single pile of ash derives from. In his 1684 essay, A New Division of the Earth, French physician Francois Bernier became the first popular classifier to separate humans into races using phenotypic characteristics. Mother's skin is the colour of vacations, her hair barefoot black, an island's only runway, reports of racist attacks. Father turns up the volume, turns us down, chews his pork, stings the taste with beer, tells mother to pass the pepper, there is never a please. He asks if she remembers the attack, the hospital, his nose, a Coca-Cola bottle picked from his skull. Yes, she mutters, the chase, dirty bitch, how will make you white, Aphrodite hard, dirty dog, trembling with the street light, please God, not tonight, the kids. In his essay of 1775 on the natural variety of mankind, J.F. Blumenbach claimed that it was environment which caused the variety in humans. In the bathroom mirror, I spat blood from my mouth, quaver breath, suburban. My brother, desperate to piss, pulled the door open, asking what happened. I tried to fight and I lost. Why? Because the island we come from is smaller than this. Their names are shorter, pronounceable, so they exist. Even after their noses break, they still don't hook like ours. Their sun is only half peeled. He lifted his top to show me 2 bruises, to remind me of something, how history found its own way of surviving, a dark wash mixed with the whites, spinning round and around. In the bathroom mirror, my brother spat blood from his mouth, Suvla breath, and home, me, desperate to piss, pulling the door open, asking what happened. He tried to fight and lost. Why? Because the island we come from is larger than this. Here, we chew up too much of their language, leave behind an alphabet of bones. We will never exist in their love songs. How many bruises does it take to make a single body? I left him, surviving history, a dark wash mixed with the whites, spinning round and around. In 1859, British naturalist Charles Darwin wrote, on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. If the house phone rings after midnight, someone you know is dying, breathing in 10 black moons under a siren or belfry. From the wound in my uncle's back leaped the first Atlas, blood escaping him like a phantom, vaulting over the spiked gates of heaven, the knife half still, half drunk, the motive, skin or prayer. We went to visit. In the window's condensation, his daughter wrote, Daddy, don't die, on the water of her breath. That evening, my father came home, one hand trumpet, the other reef, all his fists the law. In his seminal book of 1911, Hereditary in Relation to Eugenics, eugenicist Charles Davenport wrote, 2 imbecile parents, whether related or not, have only imbecile offspring. She had the same colour hair as Jesus. Most boys smile after. When we were done, I moved a blonde streak from my arm, wondering how much of my body was still mine. I smelt of rain on an old umbrella. My fingers a burnt factory. She asked if she was my first, and when I said yes, she smiled, pulling the covers up, whispering not to get too comfortable, how her father would be back, the bed, a wet flag, the duvet, breaking news. On the shelf, a gollywog above her family portrait, poised like a saint. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed 4 million people. Churchill ordered food to be sent directly to British soldiers in Europe. On hearing the number of Bengalis who had perished, he asked, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" Outside the KFC, racists have always looked so sure to me, like weathermen, driving his skull into mine like a belief. I saw how even evil can feel warm and smell good when close enough. A crowbar wedged against my throat. Slowly the lights began to wave, chips by my feet, black iron warming my skin so silently I could hear how suffering learns to soothe the jaws of antiquity. These men, irrational as any god, and me, emptying inside the promise of my oxygen tank. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad, literally mad as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. Enoch Powell, 1968. After the formalities, of course, I said London, and of course he asked again. When I said Cyprus, he leaned into his chair, recalling a family holiday, the weather sublime, the people accommodating, particularly towards the English, how it was a shame about the Turkish thing. And your parents, when did they enter here? In the late 50s, I replied. So before the Immigrants Act. Yes, I said, before. Well, good for them, he said, putting the lid on his pen, closing his pad, asking me to talk a bit more about my previous roles. In 2001, philosopher Robert Berlusconi wrote, "The construct of race was a way for white people to define those who they regarded as other. In those days, I was required to fill out forms with multiple boxes. Some I left blank. My father would notice my omission. Filling in the white option with his black biro, I crossed it out, telling him I'm going with other. My mother, wearing the same sad skin as before, said we are not white. The look he gave her was, snatching the form from me, the same X dominating so much white. Let me tell you, nobody in their right mind need make themselves such an obvious target," he affirmed. It's amazing how ideas start out, isn't it? Nigel Farage, 2016. My grandmother will die. Somewhere in her skeleton, white-sheeted, iridoform thick, her mouth all beetle. My family will gather round her body, all fig. My mother will look for coins, despite there being nothing for money to save. Another lady, dying the same, will goad our kind. Through thick tubes she'll scorn, her voice are blue bottles, hot wings, you're all dogs, foreigners and dirty. Outnumber us even in dying. The nurse will apologise for the whole of history. Drawing the curtain, mud is always the last thing to be thrown. A prayer reaching for the pride of an olive, like a hint to hold.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We're almost running out of time, but I have time for one question from the audience. They type in and I can see it on the screen. Emma is asking you, you've collaborated with musicians before, but would you consider going into music more, like Kate Tempest has done, for example?
Nah, I'm not musically minded or gifted in that regard. I mean, I've spoken poems over musicians, but over pianists, but no, I think that I'm very comfortable in the page terrain at this current juncture. So it's not something that I think I'll be pursuing anytime soon.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it. It was very nice talking to you. You were our last guest, and now we're ending this this evening. And well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosan. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Cheers.